is Jodi with Real Progress in Action. Today I have two activists here who are fighting to restore our democracy. We have Shen. He is the National Legislative Director for Wolf-PAC. And we have Aciz, and he is the National Organizing Director for Wolf-PAC. Welcome to the call, guys.
Thank you for having us, Jodi. It's a pleasure to be here.
Jodi. Yeah, it's a pleasure meeting you.
Full disclosure, I am also a national coordinator with Wolf-PAC. So these guys are, let me see, two of the, 5 actual paid employees of Wolf-PAC, and I am a volunteer. So full disclosure, I do have a little bit of a bias here. I love you guys. And I believe in what you're doing. So I just wanted to kind of give you guys an opportunity to talk about Wolf-PAC. What is this organization, and what are you working towards?
Sure thing. So Wolf-PAC is a national level grassroots organization focused on really just one issue, and that's the undue corrupting influence the money currently, unfortunately, has in our government, in Congress in particular. It is really at the root of pretty much every policy problem that our country faces right now, and it's at the root of all kinds of government dysfunction. So in our view, there are a lot of issues that are really important to Americans today, but the corruption of our government is by far the most important problem to solve first. And as an organization, we focus on getting an amendment to the US Constitution. It's not the only solution that's necessary, but it is an essential part of the solution that's going to need to happen, because the current system is enabled by a series of Supreme Court decisions, right? A lot of people know about Citizens United versus FEC back in 2010, but this trend has actually reached back several decades to the 70s with Buckley versus Vallejo, originally equating the spending of money in elections to speech. And so this has been a long-standing trend of the court. And the only ways to get around a Supreme Court, decision is a further Supreme Court decision that would overturn the previous one, or an amendment to the U.S. Constitution to go above the court and clarify what the Constitution of our country intends. And in order to get an amendment, our strategy at Wolf-PAC is actually pretty simple. There's 2 ways to get an amendment to the Constitution proposed. You can either get 2/3 of Congress to propose an amendment, or 2/3 of the state legislatures can call for a convention to propose the amendment. And there are a lot of groups working on getting an amendment through Congress, and we love each and every one of them. And their work is vitally important to this process. But we take the alternative route. We work with state legislatures across the country, trying to pass applications for a convention to propose the amendment themselves. And this does 2 things. One, it puts a tremendous amount of pressure on Congress. A lot of people don't realize that the majority of the amendments in our Constitution were actually preceded by a movement in the states applying for a convention and applying pressure on Congress to propose the amendment that they ultimately would. And the second thing it does is it holds them accountable. If Congress, at the end of the day, turns out to be actually incapable of proposing an amendment on this issue that the American people really, really need, the states are fully capable of proposing the amendment themselves. So we are, as an organization, really excited about this path. It's what we've worked on for basically our entire history. And we have 5 states signed on so far. So great progress, but definitely a long ways to go to get to the 2/3 of the states necessary.
Right. Absolutely. So then when it goes to a convention, it needs 2/3 of the states to put in an application, to pass an application for the convention to be called, and then it's 3/4 of the states to ratify it, just like the other way.
Yeah, if a convention were to actually be called by 2/3 of the states, the delegates would gather, they would debate, presumably come up with a solution, a proposed amendment, and anything that the convention proposes needs to be ratified by 3/4 of the states afterwards.
Awesome. And so what exactly is your role, John, as National Legislative Director? What exactly do you do?
So I work primarily with the volunteers, over 50,000 volunteers we have nationwide, on strategy. Right. One of the main things that we do here at Wolf-PAC, in fact, arguably the thing that we do here at Wolf-PAC, is try to pass legislation through state legislatures. And it is a complex thing to do. It's not easy at all. There are a lot of moving parts, and working with the people on the ground to make sure that we are pursuing the best possible path forward is the core of my job as the legislative director.
Mm-hmm. Especially when, I mean, I know as national coordinator working with different states, there are nuances to each state. You know, it's the session is different timing, it runs differently, you know, all kinds of moving parts. I think it's pretty amazing.
Absolutely. In terms of process and culture and power dynamics, it's sometimes startling how different the state legislatures are from one another.
Absolutely. And so, Josh, what as National Organizing Director, how do you kind of contribute to this effort?
So I work really closely with John and all the wonderful volunteer national coordinators like Jodi. Our national coordinators, we have a team of about a dozen, all volunteers. They are leaders themselves in their own states. They have gone through the process of trying to find a sponsor, going through committee hearings, you know, a lot of the experience necessary to help other teams kind of navigate those tricky waters. So myself and John, honestly, are kind of like national council, kind of advisory. We really try to do our best to make sure teams are in the best position to make progress, excuse me, with the ultimate goal of, you know, winning in their state. So primarily what I do working with John and national coordinators is really help to make sure our teams are in a position to be able to execute strategy. So it's one thing to develop it. You know, it's important to have a strategy so that team can organize around something, and that their volunteers have things to do to help towards that common goal of making progress in their state. So I really try to do my best to help all the teams be in a position to do that. So training training leaders, really developing the team structure nationally in all 50 states. This is a 50-state strategy. You know, we don't look at one state differently than the other. You know, there are states that are obviously closer, but we do look at every state as a potential state to pass. So really my goal is try to get as many active state teams with leadership working on strategy as possible, because we know when that happens, progress can happen. And when progress starts happening, anything's possible at that point.
So when we talk about money in politics, there are kind of, it seems like an abstract thing, right? It seems like something that happens in Washington or something like that. And a lot of times you really kind of have to connect it to people's everyday lives and connect it to what actually is going on. So we've seen this, you know, with pharmaceuticals. You know, the pharmaceutical industry is a major contributor to campaigns, PACs and things like that. So, and then what happens, you know, they're allowed to kind of, you know, price people out of, for example, insulin that, you know, is life-saving, life-sustaining medicine. So this is kind of one example of ways that we can kind of connect this to people's everyday lives, right? There are a lot of different things, but, you know, just kind of touching on one, right? What I'd like to talk about now is to kind of connect this to what is actually happening now. And so right now we're in this situation where we have COVID-19. This is a huge health concern, and obviously a pandemic. I don't need to tell anybody because I'm sure you're all sitting at home right now, or you know, dealing with it yourselves, right? But what we see is the legislature in Washington, the things that they're proposing it's very interesting to see who's benefiting from these things. Because of course the rhetoric is that it's there to help people, right? Is that we're trying to support the American people as they go through this. People are, ordered to stay home, and for their own safety. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but if you're going to do that, you need to support the American people, right? So we have these packages that are coming out, these relief packages that are coming out, and unfortunately what we've seen, for example, we have the $1,200 that was sent to individuals, which is great. That's great. People need that, right? That's a good thing. But at the same time, that's not nearly enough. And it's been over a month. Some people still haven't even received that. Support, and rent's coming due. The utilities need to get paid. Food needs to get paid. We see, we see these long lines at the food banks and things like that. People are in a tough position right now, and they need support from our government. So it's interesting what I'd like to discuss is how we can kind of see the influence of money in politics in the way that these packages are being proposed. So what is your take on that? Let's start with, Josh, what is your take on kind of how we can see the influence of money in politics in the way that these, the priorities and who is benefiting from these packages?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jodi. I would totally agree. It's unfortunate. I would just add it is not unexpected. For me, being in this movement, when this pandemic really started to take hold, one of the things that really came to mind for me immediately, again, being in this battle arena for campaign finance reform, is I was already extremely worried that the response was going to be inadequate, because I know that Congress no longer represents us. They represent special interests and their donors. And I do think that is on full display right now as we speak. We just spent about a week trying to get, a second wave of help for small businesses. And basically both parties agreed on the same thing they agreed on a week ago. Like, there really were no changes. There really was no added addition for, the American people, for stimulus checks, nothing. And it's great that they expanded small businesses. Don't get me wrong. My dad's a small business owner. They should be doing more for small businesses. But I think, to me, the most glaring thing in all of this is they really had an opportunity to make sure that the American people and small businesses were taken care of before they started worrying about, big special interest and large companies and, huge national conglomerates. But that was not the case. When they first did the first bailout, one of the things you'll recognize is there was actually bipartisan support. But unfortunately, when there's bipartisan support in Congress, it usually means bipartisan support for special interest. There really was no disagreements when it came to bailing out large companies. A lot of the disagreements came to what they were going to give the American people and small businesses. So to me, I could totally be wrong, but like looking at this through the lens of just an average American, trying to fight to save the system, it would have made much more sense, I think, for Congress to focus on making sure they made the American people whole, that they were going to be able to survive, and making sure that small businesses could do everything they could to keep their business up and running and keep their employees employed. And that just did not happen at all. And the reaction time from Congress is despicable. The fact that they're on break is another thing that just really irks me. They're basically on break until there's an emergency. I don't know what other kind of emergency there would be other than the greatest emergency I've ever been a part of in my life. But yeah, it just kind of shows you how just out of touch they are with the American people. And again, things that I think we all knew prior to this, but having this pandemic and having folks be responsible for helping us get through it, it just shows, I think right now it's on full display of how really bad it is and how much Congress just does not represent the American people.
Absolutely. What's your take, John?
Yeah, I think you nailed it when you said the word priorities, right? That's really what's on display with these bailout packages. Just this week, the main topic of conversation has been this. I think it's around $500 billion package that the Senate passed. It's currently still, being debated in the House. Essentially, to replenish a large part of it, to replenish the funds for the small business relief programs that were established in the first CARES Act. And it's extremely necessary because the previous funds that were allocated ran dry pretty much immediately. And there's, a lot of stories out about how the banks, prioritized which small businesses they gave the money to, and a certain amount of corruption in that case. But the bottom line was that the amount that was allocated at the beginning was wholly insufficient. Right? And I think everybody knew it at the time. Everybody knows that the amount that is going to be given this time is probably not going to be enough. It's going to run out really, really quickly. But in the initial package, as Josh alluded to, there was an enormous amount of money that was allocated for some of the largest corporations, in the world, some of whom don't pay nearly their fair share of U.S. taxes. And currently they are sitting pretty. Their share of the pile didn't run out. I think there were a number of stories at the time where certain of those companies, tried to leverage in negotiations for this money that if the government wanted to, for example, take equity stock in Boeing, he didn't need the money, right? Kind of illustrative of the fact that they don't actually need the money that much, if they have other options, restructure, declare bankruptcy. There are a number of different tools, available to some of these large corporations. And as Josh said, they have a great deal of capital already to try to, survive this, that the average American does not have. You mentioned that the amount that we got was about $1,200, one-time payment. And it has been over a month at this point, where many Americans have been shut down. A lot of Americans are out of job. And this newest package that's being, debated by Congress has no provisions so far, at the very least, for additional money coming to Americans to help them out at this time when we probably need it the most. And the reason why Congress prioritized the money in this way, right, is because it's not so much malicious, although there might be a fair amount of, malevolent intent. It's the system that's been set up. Washington has certain interests that they are consistently hearing from, who exist in their world, who they're friends with, who they rely upon for fundraising, number one, for considering legislation, the lobbyists who are consistently there in Washington, working with legislators, providing them information. Those are the interests that, unfortunately, Congress is incentivized day after day, year after year, to heed and consider first. And meanwhile, what influence that the people have, unfortunately, gets left by the wayside. Pushed for a certain amount, for sure, but ultimately it comes up short to the special interests, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think also one of the very interesting things is that there are people in the House who are, putting forth proposals for $2,000 a month. I think it was Rashida Tlaib, her package that was, I think it's Rashida Tlaib and Representative Jayapal.
Josh Hawley, too, from Missouri.
Oh, okay. Right, for for $2,000 a month, so that people can be supported and be in a stable position throughout this. Not just like, oh, here's this money and then we're going to go disappear and good luck, you're on your own. But something that would really keep people supported through this. Also, what I thought was really cool was the $1,000 a month after that, because there is going to be a period of recovery. It's not like everybody is all of a sudden going to just go back to normal. It's not like people are just going to go back to the movies and go back to the shows and go back to these these places where people are employed. So businesses are not even going, likely not going to be making the same amount of revenue, because it's going to be a gradual reacclimation, people kind of going back into those situations. So we do need to provide for people afterwards. What I think is really interesting about this is that the people who are proposing these things that are actually people-centered are the people who intentionally and are well known for the fact that they ran without any dark or super PAC money, right? So these are the people who kept themselves in a position where like we were saying, the system, like John was saying, this kind of system is the way that this happens. It's not necessarily malevolent, but it's built into the system that these are the ears that people have. And I think what's really interesting is the people who are proposing these actual people-centered things are the people who made sure that their support came from the people and not from these, big money interests. Anything to say about that?
I mean, it makes sense to a certain extent, right? You think if an elected official is very mindful to what sources of, influence, they have, or which groups or interests have influence over them, then the results are that their actions would hopefully reflect that. And I think it's great. I think that's the way government is supposed to work. Elected officials, acting on behalf of the people who got them elected, whether or not you agree with those, policies or not. How they're held accountable is supposed to be whether or not they have the support from their constituents to get elected, right? But yeah, I think the whole situation, unfortunately, it illustrates, not only what has influence over the masses, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, the amount of Congress people proposing measures like this is still in the minority among both parties. The majority are still, influenced, at least to some degree, by the interests that fund a majority of their campaigns. But it also illustrates the dynamics of power in Washington and how much influence that leadership has. If these measures catch on, I think they have the potential to really do a lot of good for the American people. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen in Washington without the backing of the institutional leadership. And I think campaign finance plays into that a fair amount. The power of leadership and the power that leadership holds, but it's not the entire picture. There's definitely a lot of institutional problems there as well.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to look much further than even Democratic leadership. One of the things that Nancy Pelosi likes to tout a lot is, being Speaker. One of the reasons that she's successful and why she should be Speaker is because she raises the most amount of money. So to John's point, that really is, unfortunately, the reality we find ourselves in is that is the power dynamic in Washington right now. And, that's why Wolf-PAC has chosen this path of working with state legislators to, kind of circumvent Congress and ultimately pressure them to do the right thing, because they're not just going to do it on their own. It's clear and abundant at this point, even though there are voices on the right and the left who are speaking out now, as John mentioned, they're in the minority. They're not the majority. Unfortunately, both parties and both leadership in both parties have come to agreements over these packages and in agreements before in the past And I don't think it's a coincidence that each time they do that, it tends to always lean towards special interest. It's pretty clear, like I said earlier, that it's just on full display right now. And yeah, I try to remain composed here as we're doing this interview, but there's parts of me right now in my belly that are just screaming in anger, because people are out there hurting right now, and this isn't something that we can even control as American people. Like, the government told us to stay home, and I understand why. It was the right call. But if this is a government-induced shutdown to protect us from COVID-19, then they have a responsibility to make sure that people can survive and maintain. And honestly, it just makes sense. It makes sense to keep people whole now versus trying to build ourselves out of a hole when this is over. To me, it just makes even just logical sense, and it would be easier to govern if people were able to stay whole and make their rent payments, car payments during this. I think it would be much easier for us to climb out of this economic hole, once we are quote unquote back to normal. So yeah, it's infuriating. I don't know if you both saw the comedian in New York that kind of went viral in the last couple of days, swearing in his car, but yeah, I mean, there's a reason why that went viral. It's not because he's a comedian or he's swearing. It's because he's taking a very logical approach and perspective from his point of view that Congress is broken. Something as easy as just saying, hey, we're going to freeze mortgages, and instead of furloughing it, we're going to have to pay this lump sum in 3 months, just add it towards the back of the loan. These are things that regular, normal Americans who aren't even tuned into politics, who are just working every day, they understand there are simple solutions to this. So the fact that there is a body of government that gets paid a lot of money to figure out these problems and they can't, I think should alarm every single American.
Yeah, it's you see these the protesters who are out there saying reopen our state. Happened in Concord last weekend. We've seen it a lot in I think it was Annapolis, somewhere in Maryland, and all over the country. And you have to understand. I mean, of course, we're saying this is not good. Don't go out there. Don't expose yourself in that way. It's one thing to stay in your car, but keep your social distance because we don't want to be. So I think it's a little bit misunderstood, but you can understand where they're coming from. They're in dire straits. We're all suffering at this point. We're all in dire straits at this point. And I think that at least fundamentally, to look at what is causing people to get to that point where they're out there. I think there is a little bit of a misunderstanding. That models and things like that, but when it comes down to it, it's people with the same problem. They're a lot of people out of work, not making money, not being able to provide for their families. So you have to at least understand that that's at the heart of it.
They were angry before this. They'll be much angrier during it, and probably even much angrier after it's over. And I agree with you. I totally understand where their anger comes from. I just think special interest is very well organized and does a great job of capitalizing on people's anger to unfortunately have them fight against their own interests. But that's another conversation for another interview with media and how they're all kind of bought and paid for as well. But yeah, I totally agree. I understand their anger. And let's ask ourselves an honest question. If the government did do a good job in their response and did make us whole, would there be protests right now? Maybe there would be, maybe there wouldn't. I'd have a tendency to believe that if people were made whole and could make, their rent and mortgage payments, there wouldn't be as much anger or a need to get out and protest to open up the states again. So, yeah, the government has responsibility here, and they've just failed us, the American people, just miserably.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys for coming on. I appreciate it so much. I'd love to have you guys on again as well. We can follow up, kind of as things are going on.
Thanks for having us, Jodi.
Thank you, Jodi.
Anytime. All right, this is Jodi with Real Progress in Action, signing off.